It is now my pleasure to introduce Ken Kreie, who will be presenting an overview of the Department of Energy's Office of Legacy Management. Ken Kreie is the Nevada Offsites Program Manager for the DOE Office of Legacy Management. He is leading the Tonopah Test Range site transition for legacy management and is also the site manager for the Nevada Offsites in New Mexico and Mississippi. Ken joined DOE in 2016, bringing over 15 years of experience as a regulatory specialist and environmental consultant. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Restoration and Waste Management from Colorado Mesa University. So I would like to now turn it over to Ken.
Hello, thank you for having me. Can everybody hear me okay?
Sounds good.
Okay. I'm going to provide you a brief overview of LM and our mission. You'll notice some of the pictures of our sites on this opening slide. Our sites are currently used as parks, as interpretive and nature centers. We have some that are pollinator and grazing sites and solar installations, to name a few. Reuse of our sites is a big part of our mission. Next slide, please. As they said, my name is Ken Kreie. I'm site manager with U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Legacy Management. Also with me is Greg Kuntz. He just joined LM and he's the LM communications lead for our sites in Nevada. Our contact info will be available at the end of the presentation. Also on the line is several people that we work with, the subject matter experts for these sites, in case you have any questions that are too tough for me, or if my internet goes out, they'll have to pick up. These guys are really familiar and have worked for years and years at a lot of sites in Nevada: Rick Finley, Patty Gallo, and Jackie Petrello, and I'm super glad to have them on my team. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about where LM came from and what we're all about, what we do, where we do it, and to let you know that a big part of our mission is engaging with communities and maintaining site records so we can tell the stories of those sites. And in Nevada, we have 3 sites that we work on. LM is currently long-term steward of 2 sites. They're Nevada Offsites, the Central Nevada Test Area, and a Project Scholl area. We're also working with EM, as some people have indicated already, on the sites at TTR and NTTR that will be transitioning to us later this year. Next slide, please. We manage closed sites that were part of our country's nuclear history. LM was formed in 2003 to protect the culture, history, and natural resources of the sites. In addition, it's our responsibility to protect human health and the environment. This work is coordinated with stakeholders, including government entities, tribal entities. There are 2 photos there from the sites that LM manages in Nevada. The top photo shows a bunch of globe mallow blooming at the Central Nevada Test Area. And the bottom photo is a view from the Scholl site looking northwest across 4 Mile Flat. It's a pretty majestic view when you're up there. I was up there in September with Chris, and they took us over and showed us that view. Next slide, please. LM is committed to managing the department's post-closure responsibilities associated with the legacy of World War II and the Cold War. This responsibility includes about 100 sites across the country that once had radioactive and chemical waste, environmental contamination, and hazardous materials. We monitor our sites in coordination with partner or oversight agencies to ensure we're in compliance with regulations and other obligations we've made. And the safety and health of our communities and workers is our #1 goal. And a big part of that goal is communicating and educating the communities and stakeholders and the public about our sites and consulting with them as we make the decisions about the management. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, we manage about 100 sites across the country and are coordinating the long-term transition planning of many more. By 2025, we expect to manage 122 sites. The various symbols that are used on the map represent the types of sites. oftentimes grouped by the applicable regulatory regime that we manage them under. And the color indicate the category. LM sites vary. We start with category 1, and those sites are records only sites, where we do, that's it, records only. We also do stakeholder engagement at the category 1 sites. And then category 2 sites does the same as the first two, records and stakeholder engagement, but it also includes annual inspections and monitoring and sampling and minor repairs that are needed when we identify them. Then we have category 3 sites that have all the elements of the title, or the category 1 and category 2 sites, but it also involves a lot more intensive work, major repairs, a remediation system that we have to have people at the site monitoring that and maintaining it. So those are the types of sites we manage there on the map. I'll tell you a little bit more about those regulatory regimes on the next slide, please. So these are some of the regulatory regimes we manage under. We manage sites that were cleaned up under Title I and Title II of UMTRCA. These are uranium mill tailings disposal cells and ore milling sites spread out across the West. We have a few in the middle of the country and on the East Coast. The remediation work done at those sites was done for Title II sites. The federal government remediated those sites. And for Title II, those sites were remediated by private licensees, and they've came over to the legacy management to be managed after the cleanup is done. LM currently manages 8 sites where remediation was conducted under CERCLA or RCRA regulations. These sites were radiologically and or chemically contaminated by federal milling, processing, research, or weapons manufacturing operations. The DOE and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers remediated 46 sites under the FFACO program, where radioactive contamination remained from the Manhattan Project and some early U.S. Atomic Energy Commission operations. The Defense Decontamination and Decommissioning Program covers a handful of sites where the department decommissioned some of the original reactors in a test mill. And under Section 151 of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, that allows for certain sites where low-level radioactive contamination was remediated by the site owner under the NRC Site Decommissioning Program to be transferred to the federal government. Currently, we only manage 1 of those sites. And then we also manage a handful of other programs, some that you're familiar with, the Nevada Offsites Program, the Plowshares sites, and we also manage the records for Yucca Mountain. Next slide, please. As I said, LM achieves its mission in partnership with many state, local, and tribal entities, in addition to other federal agencies and stakeholder groups. In Nevada, we're signatories to the FFACO. As part of that, we work with NDEP, Chris and her crew, to implement closure and post-closure activities at the sites we manage. We also work with DRI, that some of the folks have talked about tonight, to ensure that we're protecting cultural and biological resources. There's a picture there of us collaborating with NDEP and DRI at the Scholl site on the right. Next slide, please. This map shows the Nevada Offsites. These are sites that are off of the NNSS. There's 9 of these sites in 5 states where the federal government conducted nuclear testing. The 2 sites that I'm going to dive into here in a moment are CNTA and Scholl. Next slide, please. And you guys probably know a lot about these sites. Some of this may be repeat. I apologize. This is the CNTA site. It includes 3 parcels of land located north of the TTR and the NNSS. The land at the site is administered by the federal government, mostly the BLM and a portion by the U.S. Forest Service. Each parcel at the site is named after the borehole that was drilled for the underground nuclear testing on each of the parcels. These parcels and boreholes are known as UC1, UC3, and UC4. Only 1 test was conducted at CNTA in borehole UC1, and that was in 1968. There were 2 additional tests planned in boreholes UC3 and UC4, but neither of those were conducted. Next slide, please. So you'll notice there's an inset picture on the lower left that shows the 3 parcels that make up CNTA. And notice they sit in a north-south line there. A more detailed view is shown for each site going from left to right. I just wanted to clear that up. UC4 is on the left, UC1 is in the middle, and UC3 is on the right. Surface contamination resulted from drilling the UC1, UC3, and UC4 boreholes and the post-test drilling at the UC1 site. This surface contamination resulted from drilling mud that contained diesel fuel. A surface closure report was submitted and approved by the state in 2001, which included institutional controls and post-closure monitoring requirements. These ICs include 11 land use restrictions that were established for areas where soil was impacted by diesel fuel. There were 2 engineered basins constructed to contain much of that impacted soil. And the surface of the site is accessible for use by the public and is used for livestock grazing. The BLM maintains those surface use restrictions in their GIS system. So if somebody was to apply for something, the BLM would pull it up, and those use restrictions are in their GIS system, so they would know to consider our site out there. In addition to being in that system, the use restriction areas are well marked to notify visitors at the site that digging, drilling, and removal of material is not permitted without government approval at the site. Next slide, please. So this is just you got a couple of yellow circles there that showed up, and those highlight the 2 engineered basins for the diesel contaminated mud that I talked about, and some soils. These basins have fences around them to keep livestock out. Next slide, please. All right, there's a yellow arrow there that's pointing to the UC1 Central Mud Pit. The arrow is also indicating the direction of the photograph on the right. It's looking southeast. That photo shows the fencing and one of the signs which communicates the use restriction there. Next slide, please. This yellow arrow is pointing to the UC4 Mud Pit. The arrow is also indicating the direction of the photograph on the right, which is looking northeast, I believe. The photo shows the fencing, monument, and signs which communicate the use restrictions. The fence is around Mud Pit C on the right side of the picture, and the marker shows the edge of Mud Pit B on the left side of the picture. Next slide, please. And again, we have another yellow arrow at UC3. This is pointing to the UC3 Shaker Pad area and also indicating the direction of the photograph on the right, mostly south, maybe a bit southwest. The photo shows the monument and sign which communicates use restrictions. You can also, if your screen is good enough, see some of the other UR monument areas in the background, and you can also see the UC3 borehole cap. Next slide, please. Post-closure monitoring of the surface at the CNTA includes annual inspections of the engineered basin covers, vegetation of the covers, and we also ensure that the UR fencing, signs, and monuments are in good place, or in place and in good condition. We also use photo documentation to make sure that the features aren't changing over time. We're required to document and communicate these inspections every 2 years, including any pertinent observations, recommendations, any needed maintenance or additional monitoring. That report goes to the state. Next slide, please. This is a figure that shows the UC1 site where the underground nuclear test was conducted. You may be able to see there's 10 monitoring wells installed at the site to monitor for the potential migration of radionuclides in the subsurface. The only well that has detected radionuclides is the reentry well, which is UC1P2SR. That one is, I believe it's really close to surface ground zero in the center of the picture. None of the other wells have ever had any detections of radionuclides. To address the subsurface contamination, a closure report was submitted to the state and approved by them in 2016, which includes institutional controls and post-closure monitoring requirements. The institutional controls includes federal ownership of the site, and the site is withdrawn from all forms of appropriation, including mineral development. You see a new yellow arrow there at the top left of the figure. That arrow points to the withdrawal boundary. Next slide, please. Now you'll notice the yellow arrow has moved and it points to the green circle. That green circle indicates the subsurface use restriction boundary that forbids any subsurface intrusion into that area. The monument at surface ground zero notifies the public that excavation or digging is prohibited without approval by the government. And again, all this is captured in the BLM GIS system. So if the BLM gets that request from somebody to do something out of the site, they're notified that we have that site and these use restrictions are in place. Next slide, please. So our yellow arrow has moved and now it's pointing towards an orange, it's kind of an odd shape. That is the compliance boundary. The compliance boundary indicates the area where contaminant concentrations above Safe Drinking Water Act standards are to remain inside of that circle. But again, we've had no detections of radionuclides in any of the wells except for that reentry well, which is right there at surface ground zero. Next slide, please. All right, this is post-closure monitoring of the subsurface at CNTA, and that includes annual inspections. Again, we check the physical controls, confirm use restrictions are in place and signs are in good condition, and conduct general site monitoring. Every 3 years, we collect samples of groundwater to verify that radioisotopes of interest are not migrating. We're required to document, communicate these subsurface inspections every 3 years to the state, including the status of the ICs, maintenance recommendations, any change in resource use, and summarize the monitoring and sampling we've done. Next slide, please. All right, now we're moving on to Project Scholl. Project Scholl area is located about 30 miles southeast of Fallon. It's in green there with the arrow pointing to the location to the up and to the left. The land at this site is administered by the BLM, and it became part of a larger withdrawal by the Navy in 1999. The National Defense Act of 2000 reserved the surface of the Scholl site to the U.S. Navy for testing and training, while DOE retained responsibility and liability for subsurface interests at the site. Next slide, please. This photograph shows the Scholl site looking east. The underground nuclear test at Scholl was conducted in granite at about a depth of 1,211 feet in 1963. The device here was placed through an emplacement shaft, which you can see there indicated on that right black arrow. And a tunnel was mined that extended east approximately 1,000 feet. Remember, at CNTA, we drilled a borehole and placed that device. This one, again, was a borehole, an emplacement shaft was dug and a tunnel. Similar to CNTA, surface contamination was identified at the site, and a surface closure report was submitted and accepted by the state in 1998. No surface contamination remains at the site. It was all cleaned up, and no use restrictions are required for the surface. The surface of Scholl is also accessible to the public for recreation and livestock grazing. Next slide, please. This is a similar map to the CNTA. This map shows Project Scholl area with 13 monitoring wells installed at the site to monitor for the potential migration of radionuclides. And similar to this one, we've only detected radionuclides in one well. That's HC4, which is the closest well to surface ground zero. It's just south of surface ground zero on the map. None of the other wells have had detections of radionuclides. You'll notice there's a shear zone that depicts a fault running across the site from south to northeast. That yellow dash line indicates the surface of the fault, which dips to the northeast. Sorry, is it to the northwest? Rick, can you chime in? Is it to the northwest? I think it is.
Yeah, correct. Northwest.
Okay, south to the north. The black dash line indicates where the fault meets the water table. That fault acts as a barrier to groundwater flow. To address the subsurface contamination of the site, a closure report is being developed with the state, which will implement institutional controls and post-closure monitoring requirements. The closure report will be finalized in the coming weeks. The ICs include the land being under federal ownership and being withdrawn from all forms of appropriation. Again, that yellow arrow points to the withdrawal boundary. It's the big square, the black dash line. Next slide, please. The yellow arrow's moved. It's pointing towards the surface use restriction boundary. I'm sorry, the subsurface use restriction boundary. Again, this is the boundary where no subsurface intrusion is allowed. The compliance boundary at Project Scholl is the same as the use restriction boundary. Again, the use restriction boundary indicates the area where contaminant concentrations above Safe Drinking Water Act standards are to remain inside of that. Monument at surface ground zero notifies the public that excavation or digging is prohibited without approval by the government. This subsurface use restriction is also captured in the Navy's GIS system, and we're working on getting that into the BLM system as we speak. The BLM does have our withdrawal boundary in the GIS system, which serves the same purpose currently. Next slide, please. Post-closure monitoring of the subsurface at Scholl has the same requirements as CNTA. I won't go through them again so we can save us a little bit of time. Next slide, please. All right, so we've moved on from the CNTA and Scholl, and we're moving on to the NTTR and TTR FFACO sites. These are 70 sites that had or have surface and shallow contamination and debris from historic nuclear weapons testing. All corrective actions are complete at the sites. The map shows the boundary of the TTR and some of the NTTR and the NNSS. It also shows the locations of these NTTR/TTR FFACO sites. And I struggle with this. LM will call this one site when we get it, but it also is made up of 70 sites. So I don't want to confuse you if I say sites versus site. Please forgive me. This will be a unique site for LM as it's located on an active military installation that is closed to the public. The U.S. Air Force administers the lands of the NTTR and TTR through the military land withdrawal. And Sandia leases a portion of the TTR from the U.S. Air Force to conduct DOE testing operations. Next slide, please. LM will be receiving a long-term stewardship responsibility for these sites from EM later this year. As I mentioned on the last slide, there are 70 sites and they are closed under the FFACO. There is a photo on the left of EM doing some of the final cleanup work at one of the sites. LM became signatory to the FFACO when we became the managers for the Nevada Offsites in 2006. EM maintains the responsibility for these sites until the transfer is official. Right now we're aiming for September 30th. There are many installation partners at the sites, and we're working with all of them, including the NSA and FO, as they currently manage the radiological program at the sites. Next slide, please. One of the biggest activities associated with the transition of these sites is the transfer of records. This includes hard copy and electronic records. There's a picture there on the right of the first shipment of records that was sent to LM in February. We have a record center in Morgantown, West Virginia that those went to. We're also transferring a lot of data, including sample data, GIS shape files, cultural resource survey data, and much more. We're working on developing agreements and coordination procedures with the entities that we'll rely on for site access and other support like minor repair work. And we're also working with EM to help LM establish a stakeholder network so we can maintain communication with the existing stakeholders about issues regarding future actions at these sites. Next slide, please. 60 of these 70 sites will become LM Category 1 sites. These require no annual inspections or monitoring, but will require records management, stakeholder engagement. The remaining 10 sites have use restrictions and will be considered Category 2 sites at LM. And again, these require inspections in addition to the records management, stakeholder engagement. LM will be responsible for the radiological program compliance at the site, at one site with buried radioactive material. And there on the right are a few photos of some of the site signs that help us manage the use restrictions at the site. Next slide, please. The surveillance and maintenance of the 10 use restriction sites require annual inspections. This includes inspection of fences, signs, monuments, soil covers, and radiological postings. We'll have to do repairs out there as needed, including minor repairs from burrowing animals and larger repairs from erosion or subsidence. There's some photos there that show, again, some signage and monuments on the top. And then there on the bottom, there's a picture of some subsidence out there. That's the kind of repairs we expect out there at the sites. There are no monitoring wells and no sampling required at any of these sites. Next slide, please. Oh, we're done. Okay, as I promised, there's the contact info for myself and Greg Kuntz. You can reach out to either of us with questions or comments about how we manage sites in Nevada or anywhere else. There's also a link to our webpage and some other contact info. I want to thank the NSSAB for welcoming me, and I look forward to meeting you all in person, hopefully soon.